again, we're working on game 3 from test 67. So let's go ahead and pull that up. Okay, and to kind of briefly overview, I know we always have students of different familiarities with different sections or question types, game types, stuff like that. But does anyone here want to kind of start to work through the game section? What are kind of the two broad types of games or types of things we're doing on games that we'll see on the logical games section? And feel free, instead of talking over Zoom, if you'd rather, you can also go ahead and put that in the chat. Okay, awesome. So Ciara says ordering and grouping. Exactly. And I think that's such an important thing to start with. It might, depending on how you process these games, it might feel just way too obvious to even think about, but that's really how we want to start breaking down any given game. We want to think about what are the variables present, what are the elements that we're doing with them. Are we ordering them? We're ordering them, we're grouping them, or we're doing some kind of combination of the two. So just to kind of briefly overview, we want to start any game by thinking about the variables given. And then we'll think about what we're doing with those variables. Are we putting them in some kind of fixed sense of order, or are we grouping them by categories, but those categories themselves do not have any kind of sequencing element to them? So ordering versus grouping. Good. Those are kind of the things we want to keep track of, at least to start with, as we go through our initial paragraph. So I'll go ahead and read this out loud, and then I'll ask you guys to kind of think about a few different aspects and how we can start to apply these classifications to this game. So, and for anyone who's joined late, we're looking at game 3 from the logic games section of test 67. So it reads, a toy retailer is opening a small satellite store with exactly 3 aisles numbered from 1 lowest to 3 highest. 6 sections, fantasy, hobbies, music, puzzles, reading, and science, will each be confined to exactly 1 aisle, with each aisle containing at least one of the sections. Okay, so we can stop there for now. Let's think about first thing, what are the two kind of categories of variables we're given here? What are the two sets of variables that we're considering?
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess like it would be like numbered across 1 through 3, and then because there's 6 variables of the 1 through 3, like we at least know that 2 of them, or maybe more, because it says like that they'll be in those 3 columns.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Good. So one aspect are the aisles, right? Like you said, listed 1 through 3. Good. So let's put here our variables. 1 are going to be the aisles. 3. Perfect. And then what's our other variable here? What's the other kind of category of things that we're evaluating or moving around? Sections, exactly. Good. Sections. So here we could just put FHM and ERS. ERS. Okay, good. And I can see Rachel's kind of thinking into something we're going to talk about in a second, which is also how the quantities are comparing in terms of how these two groups match up. That's a really, or how these two sets of variables match up. That's a really good thing to think about. So we'll talk about that in a second. Good. Okay, now we want to think about how we can maybe start to structure these, or what characteristics these variables have and how that tells us the structure of our game board. First thing here, is there any sense of order, a fixed sense of order, inherent sense of order to one of these variable groups?
Yes, because it says there's exactly 3 aisles numbered from 1 lowest to 3 highest.
Awesome. Right, and so that tells us we know we at least have a sequencing element to this game. Exactly, right. Like you mentioned, Rachel, we have 3 aisles, 1, 2, 3. So we can kind of write those out as the main sequence element in our board. So 1, 2, 3. Now, do we also have any grouping elements here? What we mean by that is one of these variables kind of being placed into the other one.
So it doesn't like seem super clear, but just that each aisle contains at least one of the sections, whereas like a strict sequencing would say each place only holds one and no others.
Right, exactly. So it's kind of this idea that we can fit multiple variables into a different group in a sense. So we know here we have both elements now. We see the ordering element from this kind of intrinsic sense of order that we get with the aisles 1 through 3. And then we have this idea of placement. We're placing sections into aisles. And so we're grouping them by aisle, exactly. So that's what gives us both elements here. So this is something that we'll call a hybrid game or a mixed game, something that has both sequencing and grouping elements. So let's type that out. So this is a mixed or hybrid game. Grouping and ordering. Awesome. Any questions on any of this so far? Okay. Now, what we also will often, or what we'll also see on these types of mixed games is there's usually going to be kind of a dominant element and I guess the less dominant element. It can be kind of hard to, it's kind of easier visualized than stated. What we mean is usually the main structure of our game board is going to revolve around the ordering element or the grouping. Because of that, we'll know what the kind of primary aspect is and then what the secondary aspect is here. For example, here, because we're grouping these sections into the category of aisles, which has that sense of order to it, the kind of fixed dominant element here is the ordering element. Because of that, we want to structure our game board around those 3 different aisle categories. Keep in mind, we technically don't have to do that, right? We could say, no, we actually want to structure it around the sections. So let's write like, this is section F, this is section H, this is M, this is P, R, S. And then what we could do in our game board is we could actually put the aisles onto the sections. Like we can say, oh, this is going to be section 2, this is going to be 2, this is going to be 3, this is going to be 1, etc. But we can see that becomes a lot more convoluted, right? We could actually solve the game that way if we were really careful, and we probably would need more time and stuff like that. It might be a lot more challenging, but we could do that. But we can see here, usually there's going to be kind of like a dominant variable being played, or the larger group of variables, for example, being placed into what kind of forms the dominant structure of our game, which is here, the different aisles. Does that make sense to everybody? I know it can be hard to kind of describe. It's easier when we actually visualize it. And sometimes we'll realize that as we're setting up a game board. Maybe we'll start by thinking about, we want to structure it around, structure it by thinking about, we want to have it kind of divided up into 6 sections and then categorize the aisles onto the sections. But then we realize, no, it's actually going to be more clean and organized if we have the 3 sections, or the 3 aisles, put the sections in them. Then it's maintaining that fixed sense of order that we need. It's also more kind of mimicking the real life structure that they're describing, instead of this kind of more esoteric look at it. Okay. Let me go ahead and erase this. And if anyone has any questions on that, feel free to go ahead and add them. Okay, but this is our main game board setup. So this is what we'll work with as we continue on. The only other aspect we haven't really talked about are the quantities. And that was something that Rachel kind of mentioned as well. One thing we want to think about are how the 2 groups of variables relate. Here we can see we have 6 sections, but only 3 aisles. And does anyone want to kind of think about, how does that change how we need to approach this game board? Or how do we need to kind of keep track of that as we're setting this up?
Like almost thinking of it like a math problem, like there's 2 for each possible aisle.
Good, right. And what's tricky is that's one of multiple possibilities. Because here, if we look at our passage again, or our paragraph again, the only specific restriction it gives in terms of quantity is that each aisle will contain at least 1 section. So there's different permutations. We could have, for example, like you were saying, 2, 2, and 2, but we could have like 1, 1, and 4, right? Or some other version of that. We could have like 4, 1, 1, or 1, 4, 1, etc. Or we can have like a 2, 3, 1, or 1, 3, 2. So there's a lot of different permutations that are going to arise here that may or may not be relevant just based on the game type, or the questions that we'll see. So don't always feel like you have to brainstorm this. It's more that it's something to be aware of. We want to think about, how does the placement of certain variables restrict others? Like, for example, let's say we end up getting a certain rule about how there has to be this group of 3 variables, which is always together. Then we know this particular permutation, let's say we have like A, B, and C are always together. Now this particular permutation is eliminated, right? We know we have to have something like this. It's either going to be 2, 3, 1, 1, 3, 2, 1, 2, 3, something like that. Or vice versa, if we know that one particular variable is always with another one and nothing else, then this is eliminated. Everything with a 4 in it, because now we're limited to the 2, 2, 2s or the 1, 3, 2s, etc. So we're kind of thinking about 2 elements there. We're thinking about, are there more variables than spaces? If there are, and that's kind of its own thing in itself, because we also then need to think about, is everything getting included? Are there any repeats? Here it doesn't mention anything like that, so we don't need to keep track of it. But in some games, what you've probably heard of are called in-out games. We might actually have some variables which are excluded. Then what we need to do is think about adding a separate section on our board for those excluded variables. So we put an out group over here. So maybe they would tell us, of these 6 possible sections, 2 are not going to be included in the store, And so there's only going to be 4 total sections across 3 aisles. Or conversely, maybe they tell us that there can be repeats. So now we can have like 6, 6, 5 or something, or we can have 4, 6, 4 or whatever. If we're allowed to repeat across multiple aisles, then it becomes a lot more open-ended in terms of what we can do. Here we don't get a lot of those elements. We just see we see that so in our second sentence, 6 sections will each be confined to exactly 1 aisle. So that's telling us there's no repeats. So we know there's just going to be 6 total spaces for these 6 variables. And each aisle contains at least one of the sections, meaning that none of them are empty, essentially. So we can think about that as they're all going to have at least one space. So we can maybe just write that with a space like that. Okay. Any questions so far on our initial setup of this game board? Okay, perfect. So now let's go on to our rules. So it says the following conditions must hold. First one says R must be located in the same aisle as either F or M. And does anyone want to, either in the chat or out loud, think about how can we represent that visually? R must be located in the same aisle as either F or M. Good. Right. So Anisha says RM or RF, and we can just kind of draw it like that. Exactly. Right. And like Joshua was saying with the boxed enclosed. Exactly. That's a really great way to show that these are fixed together and nothing else can come or can divide them. We can't have, for example, and here we also want to represent it in the as like a vertical box because we're representing this vertically. So we want to do like RM up and down like that, or RF. That actually reminds me, I tend to do these things vertically with these game boards vertically with sequencing, but you don't have to. If you want to orient this as having our sequence on the left-hand side here, and then thinking about it kind of like, or excuse me, I do it horizontally. But if you want to write it vertically like this too, that's totally fine as well. And then we would write those boxes vertically or horizontally, excuse me, too. So it just depends on how we're orienting the board, but it's the same exact setup, just oriented differently. Okay, great. Right, and so this is a great way to represent the rule. If we want to be really just thorough about our understanding of conditional indicator words, those of you who have had workshops with me before know I like to always kind of highlight those. Or is what's called a negated sufficiency indicator word. What that means is we could write a conditional diagram to represent this rule. That would basically look like if we don't have, if we're missing the sufficient condition of RM, then we have to have RF. Or the contrapositive, if we don't have RF, then we have to have RM. That's another way of thinking about it, if that's something that kind of clicks for you. But these are the same rule. So don't feel like you have to pick one or the other. They're representing the same thing. Just one is kind of more visual, one is more like a conditional statement where we have like a sufficient and necessary condition diagram. Okay, good. Any questions so far? Okay, and let's look at our next rule. So it says F must be located in a lower numbered aisle than both M and P. Okay, so now we saw the first rule was very much a grouping rule, right? There was no mention of order to it. It was just about what has to be included in the same category as another variable. Here, it kind of has both, right? It has a grouping element. We're matching F to it's kind of not grouping. We're saying F is not with M and P. And specifically, it's not with them because it comes beforehand. So it has that sequencing element too. How can we represent this rule visually then when we have that sequencing aspect to it? Good, right? So we have different students kind of all describing it differently, but I think those are all essentially. I know it's hard to write over text, but we're kind of visualizing the same thing, which is awesome. We're seeing that we can spatially recognize that F has to be before M and P, and so we can write that as F before M and before P. Good, awesome. Keep in mind too, I can see some people are maybe writing it a little bit more like F, F, M, and P. These are the same thing. So these are both totally good ways of representing it. I prefer the former because I think it becomes easier to add more branches to our diagram here as new rules come in if we separate each variable. So for example, we can see here our next rule, rule 3, says S must be located in a lower aisle than P. Now it becomes really easy if we've already split them to just go ahead and add that aspect, S before P. Whereas here, if they're combined, we can still do that. S, an arrow, but S to P. It just becomes a little bit more tricky to read when we have this and. So I would generally recommend separating them like this for that reason, that it becomes easier to chain multiple rules together if each variable is already
Would it be,
distinct from the other.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Would
No
it be
worries.
possible for you to still say what rule 3 would look like and then how we would maybe integrate that back into rule 2? Because sometimes I think that's where I get confused because visually, like I like what you did with the M and the P. So I just need a little bit more clarity, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And then as I'm doing that, Sherry, do you have a question as well?
Yes, please. So I don't know what's going with my Law Hub account. I activated it 2 months ago and now I'm not able to get to my exams. So I was wondering if you would be able, I just want to keep up if you'd be able to put, or someone could put the game and everything in the chat for me, please.
Yeah, I wish we could display them on the board. I'm not sure if you can.
Oh, well,
Okay, so-
someone's putting it in the chat now.
perfect.
Thank you, Anisha. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Anisha. Okay, so to represent rule 3 separately first, let's think about that and then we'll combine it to rule 2. So rule 3 is saying S must be located in a lower numbered aisle than P. It's kind of the same grammar that rule 2 uses. It's basically expressing that S has to come before P. So we can write that as Anissa, sorry. S has to come before. Good. Now what we can see is there's an overlapping variable between these rules, right? What is that overlapping variable? We can see here they both have a P, exactly. Good. And this is a really common inference we can make, not only with these kind of ordering diagrams, but with any conditional diagram too. If we see something like, for example, like X is before Y and Z is before Y, we can combine those into the same diagram. X and Z are both independently before Y. It doesn't tell us anything about the relationship between X and Z, They could be happening at the same time. One could be before the other one, or vice versa. We don't know, but they're both independently before Y. So this is with an ordering diagram. With a conditional diagram, we can also make these kind of inferences. We can say, let's say we have something like, let's say something like A leads to B and B leads to C. We can see this overlap between the necessary condition from the first diagram and the sufficient condition from the second diagram. It leads us to A to B to C, or therefore A to C. So overall, it's really valuable to recognize when we have shared variables between different rules. And I know I was kind of getting ahead of myself by combining them initially, so I'm really glad we stopped and actually looked at rule 3. But this is something that we'll use on every game to make inferences. We always want to think, do I have any rules that share a particular variable or multiple variables? Because a lot of inferences will come from combining rules like that, regardless of the game type. So here we see an example on sequencing, but again, we'll also see that on grouping, for example. Or this is a hybrid game, but we see it with a sequencing rule, but it can also be something we'll see with like just a pure grouping game as well. Okay, and then so let's go ahead and combine those. And then we have our last rule, which says S cannot be located in a lower numbered aisle than H. Okay, so this one is conceptually really similar to 2 and 3, but it's a little bit more complicated. How can we represent this rule visually?
You mean like just as it is, or you want to combine all of the others?
Let's kind of think about it first as it is, and then we'll see if we can,
Okay.
excuse me, if we can combine it too. Yeah.
Well, first I put, let me go back to the thing, but I wrote it down. Signs must be, are we at signs must be located or signs cannot be located?
Science cannot be located.
So I put, S space, H space S or H dash S to show that there is S has to be anywhere below H.
Okay, good.
And then, okay.
So I like how we're thinking, and 2 people in the chat kind of visualize it the same way, putting H and S on our board as variables, and then using some kind of notation to show that H is coming before S. The issue with this particular rule, though, rule 4, is this is only covering one element of it, because
Right.
when we say that it has to be, or it can't be before it, what does this exclude that actually the rule includes?
H is before S, just like you just circled.
Right, so that's one possible option. If we're saying S cannot be lower than H, it's possible that H is lower than S, but what is also possible?
That P is lower than H and S. So it could be H, then a line, then S, then a line, then P. And then you're gonna, well, I'll wait.
Okay, yeah, I like how you're thinking, but we'll wait to add it to that. So Lacey said that, excuse me, in the chat just said, it does not mean that they cannot go together. Exactly, and that's kind of what we're missing here. So when we're saying something can't be, what's the exact language, cannot be located in a lower numbered aisle, that means they could be together on the same aisle. So here we have either H before S, or they're together. H is with S. So that's that extra element we get when we move into like those negative statements. When we're not saying like, because we're not just saying S is or H is before S or H is lower than S. We're saying S is not lower than H, but that means they could be on the same aisle together. They could be equal. Does that make sense, everybody? It's just an extra element we have to think about when we have those not statements with these kinds of ordering rules.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And to kind of broaden that to just the exam in general, I think that's one really challenging aspect in terms of how we have to approach like how we might be used to thinking about a certain logical concept in real life versus how it appears on the LSAT. What we have to remember is like in real life, let's take some kind of basic description words. Let's say like hot or like salty or what's another like good one? Let's just start with those. If we normally in real life, if someone asks you like, what's the opposite? Or let's say fast, another good one. Normally, if you're in real life, if someone asks you, what's the opposite of hot? We're probably going to say the opposite is cold. Or what's the opposite of salty? Maybe sweet. Or what's the opposite of fast? Maybe slow. On the LSAT, though, the opposite is just adding not in front of the word, right? So the opposite would actually be not hot. Oops. The opposite of hot is not cold. It's just not hot. So I'm going to add a new text box. Okay, there we go. So the opposite of hot would actually be not hot. The opposite of salty would be not salty. The opposite of fast would be not fast. The reason that that's really important is these are all subcategories that fall into this, but they're not the only options, right? If something's not hot, it might be cold, but it might just be warm. If something's not salty, it might be sweet, but it might be savory or whatever. If something's not fast, it might be slow, but it might just be like a medium velocity or something. And that's kind of what we see here applied in like a very more esoteric situation. Just because we see S is not lower than H, it doesn't mean that H is lower than S. They could also be together. So is that going to help just kind of put like a real life example of that? We can see this all over the exam. So it's something you'll see a lot on LR too. But this is a particular example of it in a game situation. Okay, good. And then, so Cher, to connect that to what you were saying about maybe connecting this rule 4 to rules 2 and 3, because of this, I would recommend just leaving this separate, because we could say, oh, it's possible that H is here, but I think that would get too confusing because that might cause us to forget that they could also be on the same aisle together. And so because of that, I would probably just leave this separate. We could like write both of them, I guess. We could say like H in front of S like we do here, or we could write or H above S. And if that works for you, there's nothing wrong with that.
That's
But-
exactly what I did.
Okay.
Not the H above S, but the H slash S, but I think I like the H above S better because it makes it more distinct.
Mhm. Well, remember, we need both elements here. So if you do want to diagram this rule 4 onto this, we want to put this aspect and this aspect, because remember, these are both possible. And that's why I think it might be, and again, it's totally subjective. that's why I think for me personally, I probably would leave this rule separate just because it can get confusing. We might forget that this doesn't have to be the case, that maybe H is before S.
Okay.
Again, it's with a lot of these rules, kind of like we saw with rule 1, we could diagram it as a conditional, we could keep it separate. I mean, we could do it as blocks. It's kind of a personal choice, but I would leave it separate just for clarity's sake.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So okay, good. So now we have all of our rules present. Does anyone have any questions on our any of these rules or anything like that so far? Okay, now that we have our rules diagrammed, we want to start to think about inferences that we can derive from those rules. And broadly speaking, there's kind of a few different ways of getting inferences. One is what we already talked about, which are overlapping variables. That's a really valuable source of inferences. So let's put that here. One that we want to think about are overlapping variables. And we already implicitly made one inference, right? We already combined rules 2 and 3. Does anyone else here see any overlapping variables?
Yes, the first one, we can add that onto the diagram, but I get really confused with that part. So I can see it and I can understand what all the rules possibly can be, but I struggle with connecting them all together.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think this rule 1 is kind of like rule 4, where because there's 2 distinct options, I think it's best to leave it separate. Again, we could, if we wanted to, like write out an or and do something like that, RF or RM. Something wrong with that, as long as you're really careful about understanding what that means to you and how you want to diagram it. But just for clarity's sake, I would probably leave it separate. But good, but the sentiment is totally true, which is we're recognizing that there's a connection between rule 1 and rules 2 and 3 with that shared F and M element. What that tells us, for example, is like we know that R can't be out here, right? Like if F is in space 1 and M is in space 2, R can't be in 3 because it has to be with one of those. Or conversely, like if F is in 2 and M is in 3, R can't be in 1 because it has to be with one of those. So even if we don't actually add that to our like composite rule like we have here, it's still good to mentally take note of that, because then that'll be something we can kind of have in the back of our mind, and maybe we'll see a certain question that's kind of going off that that familiarity or that that understanding of those rules, and then we already have that kind of ingrained. Good, but that's one source of overlap here. Another one we already saw is just the HS overlapping with this S variable here. Okay, good. So overlapping variables is a big source of inferences, but here we already did the main overlap, which was rules 2 and 3. And we've seen how 1 and 4 do overlap as well, but because they have that or element, we probably want to hold off on actually combining them with that composite rule. Okay, good. So overlapping variables is usually where I recommend starting, because it's kind of the easiest to visualize at first. Another really important source of inferences on these type of games, sequencing games, I mean, really any game, grouping games too, but especially in sequencing games or ordering, are spatial limitations. And spatial limitations is basically what we were just talking about with R. It's how the placement of one variable affects where another variable can fit. And that's kind of what brings these games to life, right? These rules don't operate in a vacuum. They also operate within the confines of this physical space. We only have 3 different categories to put things in. And we know that within that, we have another limitation, which is that there can't be any repeats, and there has to be at least one variable in each space. Because of that, there's going to be certain interactions between different variables based on how other ones are placed. So can anyone think of any spatial limitations here? And if we're not sure, I'll give us a really simple one. I know that'll kind of open up the floodgates for a lot more. So for example, if we know that F has to always come before M and P, what aisle can F never be placed in? Exactly, right. We have a couple of students saying 3. Exactly. You know, it has these variables in front of it. It can never be in our final space then. So F cannot be here. Good. Awesome. And we can see that same kind of logic is going to apply to a lot of other aspects of or a lot of other variables here. So what other variables can we also create these limitations for, these spatial limitations?
S can't be in 1.
Okay. Okay, we want to be careful with that. So why do we say S can't be in 1?
I'm sorry, I got confused. Disregard.
Okay, no, but you're thinking about it the right way. I think what we're really thinking about is, right, S can't be in 3. All right, so we have a few students saying that in the chat, right? S can't be in 3 because it has to have P in front of it. Good. And there's this temptation to think that S can't be in 1, right? Because we know in one possible option, H is going to be in front of it, but we want to remember that we could also have them together. So H and S could both be in 1 together. Okay, good. So we've accounted for the limitations with F and S. What about with M and P? Great. Okay, awesome. So this is saying M and P can't be in 1. Okay, good. Awesome. And these spatial limitations are really valuable because now we can see, especially when we consider the amount of variables and aisles we have, the fact that we've eliminated M and P for space 1, we've already eliminated a third of the possible options. Or for 3, we've already eliminated a third of the possible options, which is really significant. And so that'll definitely be something that's useful as we move on. Okay, does anyone else see any other spatial limitations here? It can either be these kind of spatial limitations in terms of like the ordering, or it can be other stuff based on the structure of different blocks or stuff like that.
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I wanted to say the first, R has to be either on the same aisle as F or M. It also applies to this scenario. If R and F are on the same aisle, then it cannot be on 3.
Right, good. Right, so if R, good, so you're saying if, for example, if R is with F, then R can't be 3. Exactly, good. That's a good way of thinking
Yeah.
about it. Mhm. Awesome. Good. So that's another example of, we talked about this earlier, I think, with which one was it? Oh, and when thinking about how R has to go with F or M, that might not be something that we want to diagram per se, because it's kind of just a specific hypothetical situation. It doesn't have to be true for every game board permutation, but it's good to have that in the back of our minds now. So it was still valuable to recognize it, because that might come up in a certain question. It might ask we might have a new condition they give us where it says like, if F is with R, then where can R not go? And we've already kind of inferred that. Exactly. Okay, awesome. Good. So we talked about spatial limitations. One other spatial limitation aspect, which I also think is not worth the time of writing out, but just to kind of connect it to something we talked about at the very beginning, for those who were here, we talked about at the beginning that there's kind of like a different permutations element to this game, because we know there has to be at least one variable per space, but we don't know exactly whether it's going to be like 2, 2, 2, like 2 here, like, oops, like for example, 2 spaces here, 2 spaces here, 2 spaces here, or whether it's like 1, 4, 1, or 1, 3, 2, or something. There's a lot of different options, but we can kind of think about the spatial limitations of this. We know that at least one of our, like if we have R here, for example, then we know this is going to have at least one, and then it can connect into those permutations. Those are so open-ended that it's probably not worth thinking about until we get into actual questions. But it's just good to keep in the back of our mind of like, when we have R, we know at least one thing is with it. So like, let's say R is in space 2. This can't be like a 3, 1, 2 permutation game or something. This is going to have at least 2 spaces or something if it has R with it. Okay, great. And then after spatial limitations, I think last thing we always want to check is just, are there any variables that were unaccounted for? So, variables. We won't always have that. We'll often have just 1, maybe 2, but we want to check if there's any variables that don't have any rules that apply to them. And so here we can see, okay, F is included, H is included, M is included, P and R are included, S is, okay. So here they're all included. Sometimes we'll have an unaccounted variable. You might hear that called like a random or a floater. What it means is that there's no rules at all that apply to a certain variable. It's really valuable to take stock of those because they get really useful when we're trying to make sample game boards. Let's say, for example, this rule wasn't here. Like they only had 3 rules instead of 4. H in that case would be that unaccounted for variable or unrestricted variable, however you want to define it. And that's really useful because we know that's kind of what we can keep for the very end. And it's going to impact the board the least. Conversely, it can also be kind of helpful to think about what variables here are most impactful. And what we kind of mean by that, it kind of ties into like the first step of which variables maybe impact the most amount of rules, or maybe which ones impact the most, the spatial aspects the most. But basically, knowing which variables have the biggest impact on the game versus the smallest impact can be useful because it can kind of help us understand what questions we might be asked or what variables we might be asked about. So here, for example, we can see that, which one? I mean, maybe F and M probably look like they're the most impactful because they're present here, they're present here, they're present here, or they're negations, they're present there. So those we can maybe say are like the most impactful variables here. Those are ones that if we know where they're placed, they're going to determine quite a bit of the rest of the board. Whereas in this hypothetical situation where this last fourth row wasn't here, H would be very unimpactful, right? Knowing that H was in 3 would not tell us anything. It does in this particular game because we have a rule for H, but I'm saying if we didn't, if we had an unaccounted for variable, that would be relatively not helpful, right? So that'd be something they'd probably be less likely to ask about initially on one of our questions because it wouldn't add a lot of information to narrow down possible game points. Does that make sense? So I'll kind of broaden that. So it's not only unaccounted variables, but also like most versus least impactful variables. And again, that's useful because the most impactful variables are generally the ones that are going to have questions designed around them because they're going to do a lot in terms of testing understanding of how these rules work together, how the rules influence the spatial limitations of the board, stuff like that. Okay, Cher, did you have a question?
Yeah, would then most versus least be like the number 4, or is it still a part of the random variables?
Oh, in terms of like a separate category here,
Yeah,
you could put it separate, but it's kind of like the reason we're thinking about it. I guess I would put it with 3 because it's kind of the reason we're thinking about are there any unaccounted for variables. It gets us in that mind frame of thinking about which variables have the most influence over this game setup and which ones are very unrestricted. And just having a good understanding of that can be helpful. That was a great question. Okay, so since we're kind of low on time, does anyone who's maybe done this game before, is there a certain question you want us to go over? Otherwise, we can just start with the first one. But just for time's sake, we'll probably only have time to go through one question. So if anyone has a request for which question you want to go over, feel free to put it in the chat. Okay, if there's no specific request, why don't we just start with the first one? So that'll be question 13. Okay, so question 13 says, so it's an if question. If questions, actually all of these except for 16 are if questions, but if questions are really valuable because those are adding new conditions. It's almost adding a new rule that we have to think about, kind of like how we're talking about here. Now we need to consider, well, how does this new rule impact all of these things? How does it impact the existing inferences we made? So in this particular question, they're saying if H is an IL1, or if IL1 contains H only, so if H is by itself, yeah, and I'll give all the answers at the end. Thanks for okay, good. So here we have H by itself. Now I want to think about these things. So how does this start to impact other elements of our board? And does anyone see any possible inferences we can make now? So if we know H is by itself in 1, what kind of stems from that here?
For me, when I look at H by itself in 1, I think then that F and S would have to go in out too because they can't go in 3.
Sorry, could you say that one more time?
If H is only in L1, then F and S has to be in L2 because they cannot go in 3.
Right. Awesome. Great. That's a really great spatial inference. Exactly. We know that F and H are forced.
I was to can you repeat read that. I just want to make sure I can get it. I didn't really hear it clearly what she was saying.
Okay, sure. So basically here, because H is by itself in one,
Mhm.
well, we know F and S only have two options, right? They can't be in three, but every variable here is getting included. So they're either going to be in one or two. But now two is also, or excuse me, now one is also closed off because we know H is by itself. So these variables F and S are forced into two because they can't be in three, and now they can't be in one either. So they'll be here. Okay, great. And then, so what stems from this now? So we've placed three of our variables. We've placed H, F, and S. How do these impact, or how do these placements impact M, P, and R?
I also use the second condition. F must be located in a lower number than M, both M and P. So I put M and P in third.
Great. Good, right? So M and P are forced into three now because we know those have to be in front of F. Okay, good. And then, okay, and then anything else? Do we see anything here with R?
No, it can go anywhere. Oh,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, the rest pretty much binary.
R is before M and or R is before F, so R can go in one.
So normally, yes, right? But remember here, the new condition they've added is that one is only for H, right? It says here, if IL1 contains H only. So normally that's true, but in this case, R is required to be in one of these. So we don't know which one, but we can at least write that. We know that H is alone, F and S are together, M and P are together, and then R can go with M or F, so it can go in 2 or 3, but we don't know yet.
So for this one, it doesn't, because of the new condition, you can no longer go to the old condition. You have to, what's the word I'm looking for? You have to revise it or, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and we have to remember it's only for this question. It's only for question 13. So they've added this new condition that IL1 contains H only, but that doesn't apply to questions 14 through 17. It's only in this like universe. It's only in this particular game board for question 13.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So now that we've set that up, we made all the inferences we can make. We thought about the overlapping variables. We thought about the spatial limitations. We sort of implicitly thought about maybe the most versus least impactful variables. Now let's look through our answers. So does anyone here, I'll just read them out and then maybe we can put in the chat which one we like the best. So A says F is located in 3, B says M is located in 2, C says P is located in 2, D says R is located in 3, E says S is located in 3, and this is a could be true question. So remember, these aren't things that are mandatory. The correct answer is something that's possible. So does anyone see what's the best or what's the correct answer here?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So we have a lot of people putting D in the chat, and that's the correct answer. Good. So we can see that R can go in either 2 or 3. Okay, awesome. And any questions on question 13 or anything from our setup or anything like that? I'll read through the other answers just so in case everyone wants to check their work. I know someone requested that. So just to, let me go and check this, just to, in case anyone already worked on this and wants to check their answers. So question 14 is, that was question 13, which is D. Question 14 is A. 15 is B. 16 is A. 17 is E.
17 is E as in Edward?
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so it looks like there's another study group going on, so I won't hold you guys up. If anyone has any final questions, feel free to let me know. And if not, have a good rest of your night.